Cardozo School 2019. Tonight we continue with 3 lectures, presentations. We will try to be a bit more strict with timing. So we will have 2 30-minute presentations. We will have a discussion after those. We will do a short break, and then we will have the last presentation in the end. I'm very happy that tonight we will have together with us for the public program Renata Salecl, Armina Pilav. They are teachers of a selected course, part of the courses of Summer School 2019. This is the first year that we collaborate with both of them. I hope the course was a good experience for participants as well as teachers. The course ends tomorrow. Tonight we also have a pleasure to have a presentation by Jelena Vesić. This is not the first time that we collaborate together, so it's a continuation of our collaboration. I'll just read briefly your biography, trying not to take so much time. Renata Salecl is a philosopher and sociologist. She's a professor of psychology and psychoanalysis of law at the School of Law, Birkbeck College, University of London, and senior researcher at the Institute of Criminology at the Faculty of Law, Ljubljana, Slovenia. She's also a recurring visiting professor at Cardozo School of Law in New York. Her last book, Tyranny of Choice, profile book 2011, has been translated to 15 languages and was featured at TED Global. Her previous books include The Spoils of Freedom, Psychoanalysis and Feminism after the Fall of Socialism, Routledge, 1994, Perversions of Love and Hate, Verso, 1998, and On Anxiety, Routledge, 2004. Her forthcoming book is called Passion for Ignorance, to be published by Princeton in 2020. So Renata has also published numerous articles on contemporary art, among them catalogue essays on Jenny Holzer, Anthony, Gormley and Sarah Sze. It's really a pleasure to have you with us. Thank you so much for doing the course and for accepting our invitation. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Albert, for the invitation, and Vala, and thank you, Loretta, for organizing everything so well. Thank you also to our students, participants who have been a great pleasure to work with these last days. I'm sharing with you a digest of one chapter from this forthcoming book on the passion for ignorance, which deals with ignorance related to trauma. In sort of this part of the world, but not only this part of the world, we have been dealing for decades with certain traumas, traumas from World War II, and we have been sort of fighting over the interpretation of the past, and a lot of memories have been sort of pushed aside, and I decided as a little kind of an experiment to look at how trauma is remembered 20 years after the current wars. Primarily, I looked at the Bosnian War. At the end of my presentation, I will also touch a little bit the war in Kosovo. So I learned that the largest population of Bosnian refugees in the United States live in St. Louis. By coincidence, there is also a very vibrant psychoanalytic community, so I decided to visit St. Louis, and my first desire was just to meet with the people who live there and speak about their trauma. Of course, I didn't come far with this program because, of course, people have been reluctant to, kind of communicate with a stranger coming to their door, and happily the psychoanalytic community there opened some kind of previously closed doors. Now when I arrived to St. Louis, I asked the taxi driver to take me to what they call Little Bosnia. Now, the taxi driver was a black man in his 60s. You know, he was furious when I demanded that I want to go to Little Bosnia. His idea was these Bosnians live much better than I do. And actually, by coincidence, he served as part of NATO forces in the Balkans. Now, his pension, he claimed, was much lower than, you know, whatever support, social support Bosnians were receiving, which is why he had to work as a taxi driver. He started complaining how well the Bosnians are living, you know, how rich some of them are, and so on. Now, when I arrived to Little Bosnia, this was a shock. Little Bosnia looks a very depressive part of St. Louis. Now, St. Louis is one of the more depressive cities in general, but Little Bosnia is like the depressive of the depressive space you can come. So searching around this place, I found immediately a restaurant called Starigrad. Now, this Starigrad, I went in, this was like really another depressive space. You know, there was like no one in. And my partner and I, we decided to order cevapcici. And, you know, after some time, finally, you know, the lady brought us some kind of something that looked like cevapcici, let's say. But when I looked around this place, I noticed that she had many kind of photos of time past. And I asked the lady where these photos were taken, and she said, this is Prijedor. So she has been from Prijedor. She came here at the time of the war, and, you know, she did not feel that she settled at all in the United States. So she had a kind of a fantasy space of the previous times, the time in ex-Yugoslavia, but in some way didn't want to talk about at all, you know, what happened to her at the time of the war, or even, you know, after when she moved to the United States. Pretty much everything I touched, you know, for her was too much. You know, she complained about life, saying pretty much she doesn't like being in the United States, but there's nowhere she can return back home. There is nothing home, you know, there is no place, no house, no nothing. Now, when I kind of studied a little bit further this place, I realized that, you know, there was sort of like a kind of a more optimistic thing happening in the football club. Now, at that time, this is the manager of the football club. They just won some kind of a tournament, and they were, you know, celebrating that they were kind of the winner of the diaspora football championship. And, you know, when I was sort of looking around, they had all kinds of these kind of posters, and here it is written, "No one is normal here." You know, with the group of their football champions, actually, you know. So I was quite surprised when they were at the same time celebrating their winning in the championship. Nonetheless, they had to kind of desire to create these pretty depressive, I found, posters. Now, theoretically, when we look at how people are living with trauma, of course we have to remember that, you know, now for decades studies in the domain of trauma have, you know, established that people push quite often aside the knowledge related to the traumatic events they experienced in order to go on living. So Dori Laub and Nanette Auerbach studied denial that appears in the presence of anguish. And they claim that this denial is actually quite often a signature of trauma. For the person to survive, the knowledge of trauma often needs to be deflected, hidden, disconnected from the ordinary experiential knowledge. Thinking about something so overwhelming that it cannot be thought about is something of an impossibility. Now, an example of the impossibility of putting trauma into words is a story told by Ruth Weinrapp, in which an adult daughter asks her mother to tell her about her experience in the concentration camp. And the mother, of course, never wanted to talk about this trauma. However, when the daughter almost like forces her to tell her the truth, you know, she decides she will write a letter to her daughter explaining in the letter what happened. Now, when the daughter received the letter, she was shocked that she received actually 4 empty pages. There was nothing the mother actually could share with her daughter about her experience in the camps. And this was in the World War II. Now, in some way, we can say that there are kind of many shades of ignorance related to war. And I remember when in Slovenia went through a short war, only 10 days in 91, already those 10 days were overwhelming. The anxiety becomes quite often, incredible. You are following the news, you are expecting the war to go on for years, and you do quite often, adopt some kind of, let's say, personal types of denials or ignorance. And I remember with a group of friends at that time, we decided that we would watch the news only a few times per day, and then we will write, during the day, we would write a book on Hitchcock and Lacan. This was quite strange, but in a way it was a survival strategy, so that because you could not do much, we were not fighting directly, but constantly running into shelter, listening to the news, in a way can be overwhelming. Now, there was also a very interesting denial on the political side when the war moved from Slovenia, when Slovenia happily, ended the war. Serbs were not too interested in keeping Slovenia in Yugoslavia, which is why after some, quite major battles, they withdrew. And when the war started in Croatia, in some way in Slovenia it was obvious that the next stage of the war will be Bosnia. However, surprisingly, at that moment, Bosnian nomenclatura allowed the Yugoslav army to store the weapons in Bosnia, still believing in the kind of a transnational character of the Yugoslav Federation. And, quite often the feeling was, we are the true Yugoslav, we believe in transnationality, we are in the middle of Europe, the war cannot happen here. And I remember that their leader, Alija Izetbegović, at that time said, "Sleep peacefully, everyone, there will be no war." So you can have, denial on the personal level before the war is happening or during the war, and you can have a political kind of denial. Now, in study on trauma done by a psychoanalyst, Jelena Vesić, he speaks also about the kind of a relationship between trauma and ignorance, and his idea was that to look in a way how normal, whatever we can call normal thinking, can become disrupted by a sense of helplessness, which is one of the common elements of trauma. As a consequence, the victim's perception of traumatic experience becomes blurred, partial or distorted, or sometimes it disappears altogether. The recollection of trauma becomes impossible, since no matter how much a victim wants to remember it, she often fails to bring salient details to mind. Now, Vesić addresses the essential question of this part of this kind of not knowing in trauma. He questions how does this not knowing actually relates to trauma, and whether we can help the victims in regard to this not knowing. Now, his idea is that sometimes imposing various forms of knowledge onto the victim can in fact exaggerate trauma. So the victim denies or pushes aside traumatic knowledge, and if someone presents to the victim knowledge from the outside, the knowledge maybe actually has something to do with what happened to the person, that can make the situation worse. I'm quoting from Vesić, who questions, is being informed, becoming more aware, therapeutically desirable? What must a person do to reassociate what has been disassociated? Now, the idea is that this requires the victim to go beyond simply knowing the trauma, for example, by listening to others talk about it. The victim has to be able to formulate her experience in her own words in such a way that she does not ignore the affects that are related to them. So we can have knowledge about something, however, in regard to how we relate to this knowledge, affects, our emotions play an important role. So we have to somehow, in a way, on our own bring knowledge and affects, in a way, together. Now, psychoanalysts know that people who are suffering from obsessional neurosis might be able to talk about trauma as if it does not affect them, as if it happened to someone else. In this case, a person behaves as if she is detached from what she is actually describing. Now, research on trauma often looks at various different types of not knowing related to trauma. So one person might live in a disassociated state, which allow her, for example, to experience life and trauma just as fragments, which she cannot integrate, while another person might be flooded by memories and unable to live in the present. Still another might try to compulsively narrate trauma and convey it to others, but constantly fails in this pursuit. The push to constantly retell the trauma can be for some also the mean that they are kind of again and again re-experiencing the pain related to it. Now, as I said before, I wanted to observe how these perceptions of trauma look like in real life, and which is why, when I was kind of doing this research in St. Louis, one of my sort of, let's say, biggest help was when I encountered people who acted as translators for the Bosnian people living there. So they were of Bosnian origins who spoke English well, and in some way they were also quite often bringing, the traumatized Bosnians to doctors, to psychiatrists. They were helping them with legal questions and so on. And in a way, the translators were kind of, I would say, in some way also translating to me, the kind of the stories, telling me the stories that they have experienced throughout the years when they have been sort of dealing with traumatized Bosnian population. Now, when I mentioned before that there was this tension already when I started, going in the direction of little Bosnia, when my taxi driver was very unhappy with my choice, of course, here we need to remember, that psychoanalysis teaches us about the sort of jouissance, the enjoyment that we often perceive that someone else is having, and that the other person in some way, lives at our expense or enjoys at our expense. Here I saw, a perfect example of this, the perception of enjoying Bosnians, rich Bosnians who are sort of kind of stealing the jouissance, the enjoyment of hardworking Americans. Now, psychoanalysis, of course, speaks a lot how nationalism and racism very much rely on this fantasy of sort of like the other stealing our enjoyment. However, if we get rid of this other quite often, we would not at all get any more enjoyment because enjoyment per se is something that we can, as split subjects, always strive towards but cannot fully possess. So going through Little Bosnia, as I mentioned, I went to this football club. Now, talking with the manager in the football club and some other people there, I encountered another element related to trauma, 20 years after, and that is sort of like a certain belief that with the help of new technologies, especially forensic science, we might come kind of closer to the closure in regard to trauma. So the gentleman who is running the football club has told me the story that at the time of the war, he was running into a shelter. With him was his 5-year-old daughter, and at the moment when they were running, a sniper in front of him killed the daughter. His daughter was buried in a graveyard. However, later that graveyard has been reopened, and the remains were thrown together with other sort of victims into sort of one of the mass graves. Later, when the mass graves were discovered, we know that they were reopened, these mass graves again, and the remains have been scattered around in smaller mass graves. Until today, we know that digging is going on for finding these remains. Now, the man that I met in St. Louis is going every summer back to Bosnia, searching for the remains of his daughter. He has deep belief that with the help of DNA analysis, he will finally find his daughter's bones and be able to build a tomb for her. This, he hopes, will allow him to move on and find some closure. Now, people who have experienced severe traumatic events often later say that they feel guilty for failing to do the right thing before the trauma occurred. At the trial of the Bosnian Serb military commander Ratko Mladic, who was one of the foremost people standing at the trial for the genocide in Srebrenica, in The Hague, the first person to testify was Elvedin Pasic from St. Louis. He, as a 14-year-old boy, had witnessed his father being taken away with other men from his village. Elvedin and his mother ended up in a concentration camp, and he later learned that his father and other men had been brutally murdered. Elvedin broke down during his testimony in The Hague, sobbing when he spoke of how he had the chance to see his father one last time at the time of the war. But as a teenager, that day he decided not to. He is still sorry to this day that he missed this opportunity. The memory of his dead father haunts him now even more since he himself became a father. Now, when he was asked what he hopes will come out of Mladic's trial, he said that he would like to learn where his father's remains are. Artana Dzidzidovic was a 12-year-old when she learned that a friend who had offered to pick some apples for her from a nearby garden in Sarajevo had been killed by an enemy fire. Ertana and her family fled the country, and they too ended up in St. Louis. Because of what she witnessed during the war, Ertana perceives herself as being radically different from women of her age. She says, "I feel 100 years old because of my experience." Nowadays, however, she rarely talks about her past. She says, "I want to set it aside and keep on living. It is not like I forgot. I just don't want to remember." Now, this strategy might be a form of willful ignorance one employs with regard to one's past. However, even if they do not want to consciously remember traumatic events, in an unconscious way, trauma often disrupts the defenses people build. Many older women in St. Louis, for example, have found refuge in work. They often work long hours in low-paid manual jobs as cleaners or helpers in restaurants. Now, it is not only that they need money. For many, work became an escape from trauma. As long as they work, memories are less likely to haunt them. And then, an accident, an illness, or another unpredictable disruption of routine occurs, and painful memories return. Now, I heard story after story that a woman would work, day and night, somehow pushing the memories aside, and then suddenly she will break her leg or something, not too traumatic, and she would be completely paralyzed, flooded by memories from the war from 20 years ago. Depression would often set in along with the inability to make sense of what happened. Now, in a Bosnian butcher shop in St. Louis, this is from the butcher shop, the image of Tito and another memorabilia. I met a guy who was a truck driver. His life was going well, he was earning good living, everything seems to be fine. The war was behind him until he had a small accident. Although physically, a car accident, physically he recovered rather quickly. Emotionally, the accident unleashed traumatic memories because of which he suffered a total collapse. He ended up in a psychiatric hospital and was never able to work again. When I saw this man, he looked like a shadow of a human being. Something deadly was in the way he talked. All energy seemed to be sucked out of this middle-aged body. In our brief encounter, he also appeared slightly paranoid, as if talking about his experience might lead to further damage. Now, when Jacques Lacan talks about trauma, he points out that after the traumatic event, something of the subject becomes detached from the symbolic order. I quote, "From then on, it will no longer be something belonging to the subject. The subject will no longer speak of it, will no longer integrate it. Nevertheless, it will remain there, somewhere spoken, by something the subject cannot control." Now, dealing with trauma in talking therapy is particularly problematic for people who come from communities where talking has been perceived as dangerous. And in former socialist countries, this is the case. In these countries, people with mental health problems were often perceived as outcasts. Moreover, in very patriarchal communities, men were also discouraged from showing their vulnerability. And also, in a way, talking in regard to the communist regime, had kind of also political problems. Todd Dean, psychiatrist, psychoanalyst who works with refugees in St. Louis, often came across, these problems. People would come to him mostly when they had problems with law. For example, when they had committed some small crime and they were afraid to lose their refugee status, or when they needed some papers. They would start talking about symptoms like nervousness, problems sleeping, and so on. Now, when at first it looked that, they might be malingering or are coming to treatment simply to get the documents, to help them with the refugee status, their sessions often led them to describe their own traumatic experiences. Todd Dean describes a patient whom he calls Ibro. He invented this name to kind of not to reveal the identity of the man. This Ibro was complaining about his asthma. His symptoms got worse every Christmas. So much so that he was unable to make a phone call to Europe, especially to Bosnia, to talk with his relatives. In analysis, Ibro remembers the time when he first became physically unable to talk on the phone, and that was during the war. He was not aware during the war that Bosnian Serbs were building camps in a nearby village, and was shocked when men from his own village were suddenly taken away and never came back. His wife encouraged him to disappear, saying that women and children are usually spared in such circumstances. He did go into hiding. However, when a few days later he called home, he learned that his wife and children had been taken to the camps. After hearing this devastating news, he suddenly became unable to use the telephone again. After the war, when he was reunited with his family, they immigrated to the United States. There, he again became incapable of talking on the phone. In addition, he started having moments when he found himself crying uncontrollably. Now, this man perceived his problems a simply medical issue. He was going from doctor to doctor complaining about asthma, searching for physical cause. He also claimed that he did not speak English well, which is why a translator helped him when he talked to the analyst. However, one day, the translator was not able to come to the session. That day, Ibro had no problem expressing himself in English. Suddenly, things changed, also regarding how he perceived his troubles. Instead of searching for physical causes for his inability to talk on the phone, this man finally allowed himself to deal with his emotions and slowly started addressing his traumatic memories of the war. Now, a Bosnian man who used to live in a Serb-dominated part of Bosnia was warned before the war that his life might be in danger, which is why he decided to find shelter in the woods near his town. When the war started, this man continued hiding in the woods for 2 more years until he was captured by the Serbian army and taken into a concentration camp. Happily, he survived and ended up as a refugee in Denmark. Now, when he was applying for refugee status, he started denying that the war actually happened. He was telling stories about his life in the woods without admitting that he was hiding because of the war. The person also denied that he suffered any trauma. However, he was constantly telling about the trauma that happened to other people, without ever consciously acknowledging that he might have been talking about his own trauma. Now, when refugees are dealing with traumatic experiences in the past, it is often challenging for them to learn something new and to adapt to the new country where they live. And there have been a lot of examples I learned about the people who were intelligent, who suddenly could not learn, for example, basic information to pass the citizenship test. In the United States, for example, they wouldn't even learn, what's the longest river, what's the capital of the country, and so on. And, talking with the psychiatrist, of course, I learned also about other examples where they dealt with these problems. Refugees, for example, from Somalia had very similar problems of being unable to learn. And one case which interested me especially was a case of a woman, I will call her Ardo, a refugee from Somalia who fled violence in her homeland almost 20 years ago, ended as a refugee in the United States, wanted to settle in this environment. However, she could not learn English at all. And she had failed this citizenship test on many attempts. Now, when lawyers were helping this woman, they became, desperate. They didn't know anymore what to do. She was normally intelligent. So they consulted Todd Dean, who took her in treatment, and he observed that her trauma, the trauma of this woman, was related in a way to how she perceived coldness and what she perceived as being warm. Now, when she was first sent to the United States, she settled in Michigan, which is a very cold part of the United States. She constantly complained of being cold. Now, she spent all the days in the kitchen with other women near the stove. That was the only place where she felt sort of safe. But then she had a tiny small accident, on an ice. She slept on the ice, and that, kind of brought a complete psychic collapse. She fell into depression. Happily, with the therapy years later, she kind of started talking about the sexual abuse she experienced in her homeland and, traumas related to it. British psychoanalyst Rosine Joseph Perlberg writes on memory as something that is quite often frozen in time. She, for example, speaks about one of her patients, a woman, not a refugee, just like a Norman woman, she calls her Maria, who was constantly telling the same story that happened to her 30 years ago, as if she was completely stuck in time. Now, this woman was in a way frozen, like frozen in time. Now, when she was speaking about other issues in her life, she was also constantly speaking about sort of kind of sort of frozen emotions, frozen mother. Everything in this case was also related to kind of coldness. Now, at one point, this woman developed normal cold, just like a normal cold. And it was, this normal cold that kind of slowly triggered for her to start, in a way, working through her trauma, through a long process in some way. She finally was able to kind of exit this being stuck in time. Psychoanalyst Giulio Granel noticed that in some people an accident helps to give shape to what was previously somehow without shape. Before the accident, a person might be, for example, in an intolerable situation, but then all of a sudden this unsolvable drama of the inner world is replaced by the drama in the outside world, with a kind of an accident or a disaster. The latter becomes a problem that the individual then needs to deal with. Now, British psychoanalyst William Bion also perceived disaster as a way an individual has kind of a way to look for meaning. A process of individual development is often formed through moments of violence and chaos. And sometimes a new idea emerges only through the onset of destructive forces. Now, people who experience the trauma of losing the loved one often, sort of are kind of deeply in pain because they don't know where, their loved one is buried. And I highly recommend you to see a short film, Red Rubber Boots, on YouTube by Jasmila Žbanić, who shows a mother searching for the remains of her two small sons who died during the war. And, she cannot find them. And then at the end she says, I hope they will find red rubber boots, which one of the sons was wearing when he was killed, because plastic doesn't decompose. And at the end, this woman also says something incredibly shocking, striking. She says, other women who have lost children in the war are meeting their children in the dreams. And I don't dream about my children. And she says, that these other women are experiencing that children appear in their dreams and tell them that they are okay. And, this woman was kind of denied even this possibility to kind of, let's say, find the children, at least in the dreams. Now, Amor Mašović is the forensic scientist who is searching for the DNA, helping with the help of the DNA, searching for the remains of the deceased in the Bosnian mass graves. And, in one of the interviews, he pointed out that for him, in a way, one of the biggest victims are those relatives who are still living, and cannot find, sort of a way to kind of move forward. He said the families of the missings are the biggest victims of war. You have nowhere to mourn. I call this genocide that lasts. It is no longer a crime against the dead. This is the genocide of the living. For them, the war has not ended. Now, at the end, let me touch the problem of graves, and especially sort of the question of empty graves. Our part of the Balkan has been depicted as a land of graves, even before these last wars. Now, however, dead bodies seems to be everywhere. Sebastian Junger observed when he visited Kosovo that mass graves seems to be at every corner. One forensic scientist there said that everyone thinks that he has a body in his backyard. We often hope that with the help of forensic, we will symbolically restore the dead to the annals of the living, so that their shades would stop speaking anew. However, we often forget the fantasies and narratives that we create around the material traces related to loss. Now, after the large-scale atrocities, we often encounter a battle over these remains and also a battle over numbers. Already in the time of the Holocaust, especially with the Holocaust denial, but also with the Bosnian and Kosovo war, we have kind of all pressing examples of such debates about the numbers, how many people were killed, how many have been found. In the Balkan context, the question over the exact number of victims became a battle for the interpretation of the war. Scaling down the numbers or augmenting them became ways for the two sides after the war to continue the conflict through statistics. Now, the image of mass graves also became a place where, on top of statistics, the question of the visibility and non-visibility of the remnants of crime becomes played out. Slobodan Milošević was especially a master of both kind of numerical revisionism and negation. He even demanded a BBC journalist who testified at the time of his trial in The Hague to admit that he saw nothing in the alleged mass graves in Kosovo. Now here we see a similar strategy to that of Freud Leuchter, the famous Holocaust denier, who said that he was more convinced by what he did not see than by what he saw on the site of the Auschwitz concentration camp. In her very interesting work on Kosovo forensic research, Rachel Sear questions the logic of the empty tomb in the search for the remnants of the war. Christianity gives us the stories of Christ's empty tomb, sites of martyrdom and commemoration of mass graves long before the emergence of forensic science. This is to say that people previously had other long-established ritualistic mechanisms which helped them deal with the element of the unknown, the loss that always, in a way, kind of haunts us about such graves. Rachel Sear warns us that the progress in forensics leads contemporary memory of mass death to assume kind of different features. She says that this search for forensic kind of material elements transforms archival memory and assimilates it to some kind of a natural or physical history, and it carries with it real potential of decentering eyewitnesses and survivor testimonies. Because of these physical traces, because of these physical traces gain some kind of a, special power, and once, she says, landscape, was mute, now it brims with, kind of a signatory potential. Now, physical traces are often the most powerful weapon against, denial, especially, deniers of atrocities. However, the belief in forensic science also opens up the fantasy that everything can be recovered, if only the proper technique can be developed. Sear thus warns that forensics, in a way, opens up the fantasy of finding an ultimate witness, the one who could see and recover everything. Now, some say that there is a difference between tombs and graves. And that this difference kind of pertains to the fact that tombs try to retroactively inscribe symbolic meaning into the sites, which might very well be empty, while graves bear a fullness that can be looked into, analyzed, or counted. One can also take an empty tomb not as a sign that something in it is missing, but as a mark of a loss that no physical evidence can eradicate. A loss that every individual deals with in his or her own way, a loss that evades words, a loss around which we can circulate, create stories, but a loss that is often linked to silence. Sometimes even the silence of dreams, not even only the silence of words. Let me finish by going back to the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, which was established in 1993 to persecute war crimes that happened at the collapse of Yugoslavia. At that time, we can say that we also encountered a kind of a new knowledge production. During these trials, at the tribunal, factual or forensic truth has been presented together with narrative truth of both survivors and the perpetrators. Simultaneously, however, the perpetrators, especially those living in the Serb-controlled territory in Bosnia and Herzegovina, formed knowledge of their own with regard to the war, mostly denied their crime and presenting themselves as victims. At the trial in The Hague, the perpetrators have formed all kinds of excuses when they were asked to testify. When Ratko Mladić was called to the witness stand at the trial of his collaborator, the former psychiatrist Radovan Karadzic, he said that he could not talk because he did not have his dentures, his artificial teeth. Mladić demanded that his false teeth be brought to the courtroom so that he would be able to speak. Now, when the guards complied with this demand, Mladić, however, did not share his knowledge about what had happened during the war, but instead started an attack on the members of the judiciary, saying, "I do not recognize this Hague court. It is a NATO creation, a satanic court, not a court of justice. It is trying us for protecting our own people from you." Mladić's lawyer, Branko Lukić, tried to save the situation by claiming that in any event, his elderly client cannot be of much help in court since his recollection of events is shaky, as a result of him suffering from what he called a syndrome known as deception of memory. Lukić explained this syndrome. It is a category of memory disorder, which means that somebody cannot differentiate between truth and fact, because they speak the truth even if they are not doing so. Now, while Lukić might have believed that he was helping his client with this confusing explanation of an alleged memory disorder, he inadvertently pointed out that Mladić's refusal to speak was in itself a mode of speaking. Now, Mladić's courtroom drama offers an acute contrast to the way many of his victims behaved when they were lined up and shot in large numbers. At Mladić's trial, a homemade video was shown which depicted the death of a 16-year-old boy, Dino Salihović, who was with his group of other Muslim men rounded up in the village of Trnovo before they were brutally killed. The film was the work of one of the Bosnian Serb soldiers who carried out the mass shootings. Dino was taunted by his murderers that he would die a virgin. However, when he was about to die, as it is sort of said in the movie, Dino didn't run, didn't scream, didn't cry. We watched this young man with dignity and resignation walk forward, hands bound behind his back, standing momentarily until the camera was trained on him. We watched a burst of gunfire tear through his back. Now, numerous refugees from Bosnian war are now living around the world with similar memories of having witnessed a crime and not being able to do anything to stop it. Sadly, many of them are passive observers of life around them in their new countries, and while they try to forget what they have witnessed at the time of war, traumatic memories find ever new ways to resurface. On my last day in St. Louis, I visited a Bosnian grocery store, which was full of produce from the former Yugoslavia, for Republic of the former Yugoslavia. Slovenian fruit juice, mineral water shared space on the shelves with Croatian fish tins, Serbian beans next to Bosnian coffee and sweets. Behind the counter was this large photo of the late President Tito, neatly dressed in a military uniform, adorned with decorations. The shop looked like a fairy tale fantasy space, a harmonious union of nations represented through their food produce. The place, however, was deserted, as if the items of food and drink were all that were left of the long-lost past. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Please, if you have questions, try to memorize them if you can. And we will have a session of questions and discussion after the presentation by Armina Pilav. So just briefly to read your bio. So Armina Pilav is a feminist, architect, guest researcher and lecturer at the Faculty of Architecture and Built Environment, Delft. She received the Marie Curie Individual Fellowship for her on-war space research, 2016-2018. Armina's research, practice, and teaching intersects focus on the topic of space, body, and politics in extreme conditions of war destruction. She analyzes ecologies of transformations of nature, space, and society during and after wartime, through archiving practices, transitional architectures, and post-traumatic landscape systems. Armina uses cross-media collaborative methods and tools in teaching, researching processes, and exhibitions. She publishes in magazines, academic journals, exhibits regularly, and her recent research on the destruction of Sarajevo and its inhabitants' transformation of violence has been exhibited at the Venice Biennial of Architecture 2018. Armina is a member of the Association for Culture and Art, Crvena in Sarajevo. Thanks so much for being here. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Invitation. Yes, I'm doing it like a bit fragmented. Thanks everyone for being here. Thank you also for the invitation. And yeah, I think for me, like to work in Sarajevo, in Prishtina, or in Zagreb, in Ljubljana is equally important than being somewhere else, because whatever I'm doing, I learn in our countries. So kind of, it's not an interesting reference, but we have to do it. So. And I will actually start my presentation situated transformation of violence in post-traumatic landscape system of Neretva River and Mostar. It's a southern city of Bosnia and Herzegovina, with a short video that actually shows what is the focus in Mostar today, both for tourists but also for politicians and all people who are kind of not only living there but trying to make her life there. Maybe from the video that I show, you could also kind of imagine what kind of research methods I would be interested in and what kind of approach to the city I could have in this analysis. And it is about exploration of the hybrid landscape of Neretva River in relation to the city of Mostar. I took Neretva River as a living, growing archive of the war and post-war spatial and social traumas. And I've also, in this fragment of the research, have this methodological intent to bring perspectives of post-human theory into the architectural landscape research relying on the work of Donna Haraway and Rosie Braidotti, as well as other concepts as are non-standard architecture by Renata Salecl or matter memory by Iranian philosopher Rezene Berestani. I'm also interested to observe the transformation of the war violence, taking nature and built environment as a medium for survival, ephemeral evidence, and deterritorialization. I'm not the only one, and I will give you a few references just for the sake of expanding a little bit this field. And recently I found out this work of Renata Salecl that I find very interesting, and she works in fields of sociology and legal studies. And she took the ocean as legal archive of slavery, displacements and legal violence, exploring how laws archive rise the authority and legitimacy of law. And the book that the project that she's writing about actually is related to the First World War, and both the refugees, Punjabi refugees who came from Hong Kong to Vancouver in 1933, who were pushed back, and then finally were never accepted by the Canadian, by the Hong Kong, and they were again sent to another country. So there are all sets of analysis that she's doing in this trajectory of the refugees in different times. But what I was interested in her work is like when she, and there is a quote also on this slide, when she said that oceans cover more than 70% of the Earth's surface. However, they are regularly placed beyond the forces of law, politics, and history. For writers of slavery, however, oceans are useful to think with. She is proposing to think with and write with the ocean. What I'm also kind of interested in when I'm interested in like war and post-war materiality in our countries. The other example are the Bosnian architects who during the war actually instead of building, designing, were documenting the destruction of the city, changing their methods of work. And what we learned in the school as architects suddenly became something else. So writing diaries, sketching destruction, analysis, different type of work. And they also published a magazine in 1993 with different documenting projects of the city destruction that today I think are extremely valuable. And two of them, Sabahudin Špilja and Horst Čurić, in the project Map of Sarajevo City Destruction, they write that architecture, whether it may be good or bad, expensive or cheap, representative or not, is material medium which most directly and with exception of human victims and most convincingly reflects terrible war destruction consequences. Well, the research on the Neretva started like recently in Mostar in September 2017, but kind of we started to put down some things on the paper and what we are going to do. We show my research fellows. Damir is a diver and archaeologist, and he's from Mostar, and Matija, the guy who was keeping the camera, he's an Intermedia artist from Zagreb. And like we kind of joined together our different interests to try to do this research. Actually started from river Neretva. As I told you, I took it as a flowing archive of war, and I wrote short text to Neretva that I would like to share with you, and it goes like this. Walking on your river banks, attracted by the contaminated greenish color of your water, listening to the sound of the water stream, looking at the shapes of the water flow, immersing my hands and foot in your cold water, I was trying to become a river. It was a moment of looking for a relationship between you and me and all materials that you contain now. Deep inside me, I was asking many silent questions that I'm now kind of sharing with you. And these questions are like, how the rivers are born, how did you decide where to flow? If I will ever have a daughter, can I call her Neretva? How was and is your relationship with the humans, land, sky, air, your stream bed, and underwater world? How do you archive human made materials and other foreign bodies that are inhabiting you? How did war in Mostar started for you? Did that war ever finished for you? In my research process, I argued within the war-affected landscape system of Neretva and Mostar, both humans and non-humans, I'm talking about animals, plants, objects, create hybrid relationship with the war materiality of the destroyed city and the river. Well, in attempts to answer all these questions, it's not enough to write a text to the river, and even though it's poetic and I had urgency to do that, I also visited different archives and also different maps, studied different maps, created a new one with my students from TU Delft, because we were studying the last year Neretva and Mostar. engage with the riverbanks in many different ways. And this work looks in different temporalities because they are extremely related, and you will see how and why. During the war, when military destructive operations and inhabitants protective activities occurred, focusing on bridges of Mostar, because the river goes through the city, it's really like it's like, I always say the river is bigger of the city, bigger than the city. And then after the war, when the military violence stopped in the peace agreement in 1995, it continued to be part of the landscape system in form of spatial and social trauma. The bridges of Mostar that crosses Neretva river, since the first stone bridge that has been built in 1566, the one that you saw at the beginning, played an important role for the spatial continuity between the two opposite river banks, like fixed points, as well as for urban development of the city. While the Neretva, in my view, in certain way, I'm quoting Radiotti here, is deteriorizing element of this space, also of images, of narratives, and also belonging to some space. It has that power, I would say. Well, on the following slides, I will also show destroyed and temporary war bridges in Mostar that were done during the war. Extreme urban ecological transformation of the city, riverbanks and the river stream bed started in 1992 when the modern existing bridges were destroyed with explosive detonations by the Yugoslav National Army. That as the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina started, became Serbian army, like we are totally appropriate simply. Not simply, but some processes. Anyway, this is not the theme. But what I wanted to tell you that I don't know how many of you know that, but many bridges that are designed in the world has the section in their how to say pillars or the part where you can add explosive to destroy them in case of some emergency, or if you want to cut some territories, if you want to defend yourself. Depends. Like there are many reasons to destroy the bridges. Well, the bridges in Mostar were modern bridges were all destroyed in that way. And Mostar is the city that, when you make interviews with people, had two wars. So one is when this when this moment of destruction of the bridges happened. And then the second war, what happened actually later, I will show you this another bridge that is destroyed. And the second war is related to the year 1993, when the last bridge over the river was destroyed by the Croatian army that was controlling the western part of the city. So actually this bridge was built during the Ottoman period, and somehow we can consider the specific moment of the old bridge destruction as one of the main spatial elements of the administrative and political division of the Mostar of today. And after the old bridge destruction, the city and inhabitants were spatially divided by the Neretva river, and as a consequence, everyday life and basic needs as acquiring food or other exchanges between inhabitants on both sides of the river became dangerous, difficult, or impossible. As a reaction to this situation, like two sides of the city with big river that you cannot cross easily, people started to build temporary bridges. And these temporary bridges were built in different parts, connecting like different few houses. They were not big, they were very also themselves vulnerable, and under this like maybe would last 1 month, 1 year, depends what was the material. And they were also built by all available materials in the city that people would collect. Here you can see like 2 of them, but they were like about 7 to 10. We are still not sure about it. We are trying to understand it. And these images of the bridges and the river are both immaterial, material traces of the everyday life in Mostar, because they don't exist anymore today. There are some traces of it that are not at all in commemorative or any kind of narrative of the city. So they are kind of a side of remembering politics, let's say. They are crossing in non-linear way war times with the pre-war and after the war times, including many agents and respective forms. As I said before, like human, non-human, the life of animals, plants and objects, and you will see that later on. Then architectonic materials in broader sense, urban, fluvial and geomorphological materials, as well as hybrids created from their accidental or design encounters. So after showing you the archival materials, I would like to go back to the present of the Mostar, that is well known internationally as divided city on east and west Mostar, with dual administrative offices, schooling, hospitals, post office, everything in two, doubled, all due to the last war. As the official narrative says, it is divided between ethnic groups of Bosnian Croats and Bosniaks, the ethnic name reserved for the Muslim social groups. The narrative and images of political and spatial divisions officially started with the end of the war, like between 1995 and 1996, and are continually proposed by the local political agendas, academic research and books as well, not only politicians. So it's kind of common to freeze this. These are looking at the dividing presence of Mostar through forms of social coexistence of different ethnicities in the past rather than today, with the nostalgic analysis of its urban space mostly based on the narrative on multiculturalism, and destroys beautiful architecture that we don't have anymore, but maybe we have something else that we are not kind of interested in. So also Shipra Naran Suri, I would like to quote her, she wrote a paper entitled like Two Cities with No Soul, Planning for Division and Reunification in Post-War Mostar. And I will quote one part of her paper very shortly just to give you an impression how this division is inscribed already in any kind of work. As the theme of divided cities has become increasingly fashionable in recent years, many authors have attempted to address the nature and impact of urban divisions in cities such as Johannesburg, Nicosia, Beirut, Jerusalem, and even Mostar, and proposed policy as well as design tools to reunify them through planning practices of divided cities. I don't have much experience, I would say, in these war studies, but I would say that all these planning practices are pretty impossible in our context, and like very firm or Western ideas how we should observe our cities, how we should rebuild them, or how we should live like in a clean and kind of organized environment. So after the war, everything becomes fragmented, so it's very difficult to imagine this situation, or it takes maybe time. So. And in relation to the last quote, an amount of four that are fascinated by the condition of divided cities making it stable and universal image both theoretically and spatially, I'm trying to argue possible rejections of universalism as both idea and representation, in favor of embedded and embodied relational forms of knowledge production. I read a quote of Rosie Dragoti from Rejections of. And as you can also see on the slide. So I'm interested to take our cities as transitional versus divided cities, or problematic, or post-war, or because a lot of time passed, we are now 20, almost 30 years after the war, so I think new, paradigms should be, or epistemes proposed to deal with this. So to reject these universal ideas, the main research sites are around the bridges, crossing Neretva, and their material transformation started at the beginning of the war in 1992. I assume these bridges as the main figures of the proposed reading of the contemporary Mostar as a transitional city, while searching for other narratives and images of it than the well-known image, as I mentioned, the one that is divided. So, in the overall, finally assuming Mostar as a transitional city still relies on historical spaces, narratives, and identities from Ottoman occupation, Austro-Hungarian occupation, if you want, Yugoslavian periods, these pasts are all violently transformed, and they are part of our cities, but maybe not necessarily anymore our identity, I would say. So I would like to share some methods and kind of, I would call them like questions, research questions as well, that are open maps and spatial diagrams, what I'm using in doing this work. I take shame as well as a tool, spaces of shame as a consequence of political division, looking how to reappropriate the city. I'm interested in spatial hate. I'm not interested in love for the city, or how you kind of want to relate to your city in the most positivistic way, because that's not the case. Post-traumatic landscapes, where I'm using a lot of work from Riza Negarestani, who does a lot of work on geotrauma, how actually Earth is remembering the trauma, and this quote that trauma is not personal and the time of the Earth is recorded, knotted up inside us. All human experience is an encrypted message from, he's using this, encrypted word for the land, to the cosmos, the scream of the Earth. Then I'm also looking at spaces of disruption, and there are also other scholars who are doing that, like Camilo Boano, he's also architect. Residual spaces, matter memory also is quite important for me. Again, it's from the work of Negarestani. exploring archives, and I'm kind of interested in this idea of avoiding identity of, and I will try to expand a little bit on that. I find that I mentioned Bernard Cachet at the beginning, and I find his thought on identity in his book Earth Moves from 1995 maybe as appropriate theoretical input to continue with the process of defining the transitional city. And he writes, generally today it no longer seems possible to think in terms of identity, whether it refers to the identity of a place or of a self. The substantialist way of thinking seems to lead to a dead end, for as soon as one attributes a particular identity to a particular place, the only possible modes of intervention then become imitation, dissimulation, or minimalism. A false notion of the past prevents the present from happening. This is present of Mostar. And in order to avoid imitation of the past, I'm quoting him again, one must learn to read a space of these transitions or transistence, as he said, that allow us to analyze and represent the traditional city of Mostar and Neretva in form of landscape system, including their inhabitants using different scales, aiming to, as Donna Haraway put it, not to remember, but to remember, like to put different things together. So how we are going to do it, I think it's kind of individual, or to commemorate, as an active process that attempts to reprise, revive, retake, recuperate what is lost in the present related to the river, the city, and practices of their current inhabitants. And finally, I would like to show you, because I mentioned this underwater filming, I mentioned all kinds of different research methods, archives, and different, how to say, hybrids that were formed in this territory. And I would like to share this very short video with you that is showing what kind of materials we found and how we observe Neretva, because it's a very beautiful river, and this beauty became also problematic, because if you talk to the people, they would say, you can drink water, and it's actually very polluted and very... So the image and what you can find in the river, it's under the water, not all of them, but most of them. So I would like to finish here, and we can also discuss, I think we gave a lot of materials to think trauma in space, and I'm really happy to share this experience with Renata because, yeah.
Thank you so much. Renata, can I also invite you to, if you can, join Armina in the... Thank you so much. If anyone has any questions, now is the time. I want to ask something. I mean, I'm not sure if this is the first time that you work together.
It's the first time.
For the workshop, for the course, officially to call it. And what were the dynamics? You know, like, is this the beginning of something bigger as a collaboration as well? And how did this trigger a different energy within the group of students that you had together? Because this is also, I guess, a learning experience for both of you.
Yes,
and share this knowledge and not only.
You can say.
Well, I think that it's interesting to, how to say, to exchange research and knowledge in any space, and also to have group of people who are interested in this topic. I was telling when we arrived, I mean, when you said that there is a big number of, there is the growing interest. As you said, like there are many applications for your course. I was like, I have to be honest, I was happy and sad at the same time because I don't think it's a good sign, you know. You know, like we have many wars and many problems in the world, and so I said, okay, that's one thing, but the other thing is also, it's true that we are not trained to deal with this kind of contexts, you know. And it's very specific knowledge, I would say, and very often you have to experience war to be accredited to talk about it. So it's also something that people who experience the war, even myself sometimes, I'm bringing this trauma around and saying, what are you saying, this is not true, and you are always trying to look.
Be a survivor, you know.
Yeah, there is always this, and also my work actually helped me to kind of step out of this idea and try to think about others in the similar situation. And also the reason is that when I studied in the post-war Sarajevo, and we didn't study the war city. We were all trained looking Western examples, hoping to become Renzo Piano one day, at least half of us. And I think that was not only that, but also we didn't study Yugoslavian modernism. We didn't study Yugoslavian heritage. So it was like new systems, new pedagogies, so maybe it's part of the denial or forgetting or political project.
Or refusal
to and even today it's difficult to propose this kind of idea that I'm proposing in Bosnia because there is still dominant narrative on divisions, who did what. Counting the numbers, as you said, the numbers are very important. So it's like, and I to reply to you, I hope that we will continue to work on this.
I'm very pleased that Armina joined me at this summer school. I have learned a lot, and actually, I think I would have probably bored students to death with theory without Armina, and I'm not used to teach art students, so you know, like to learn how to engage students, that they think themselves, that they search for answers. This was like a learning experience, I must say, for me, and we had a really great class, and we, both of us were amazed by our students, how many points of trauma, for example, they found in the city, which was one of the assignments they had, like elements that they observed that are related to past war, but also to the sort of like the post-conflict zone. And so For me, moving out of just working in the theory has been sometimes a challenge, so sometimes probably I would stick more with the text or go more with a kind of a heavy theory, but I guess that, having about 90% of students coming from the art, I think it was a blessing that that I had you with the practice of actually teaching art students and students in the domain of architecture.
And also we did small, I don't know if someone of you wants to...
But you have to ask our students how they survived. Yes, this is their product.
You want to say something? Anyone from the group, if you want to?
Yeah.
So you should explain maybe the map.
Okay, so we...
But are any of those participants in this course here?
Yes, we are all here.
Can you please stand up? Okay, but how was this experience for you as well? Because, like, when I said that this was among more, I don't want to mention the word attractive courses, but courses that attracted a lot of attention. And we were also a bit disappointed, to tell you the truth, because, like, whenever someone mentions trauma, we were like, these types of courses and whatever, which were very fashionable after the war. You had a number of NGOs engaged, working with children and similar projects, and no ethics involved, no, let's say, measures taken to protect those who are somehow engaged in this sort of healing, research-based work and things like that. But of course, this was a different project. At the same time, we were looking forward to see what comes out of it. So what comes out of it and how this potentially can be a continuing collaboration with participants in the course, and what kind of other perspectives this opens. Because, I mean, my personal view is that when you go through the city, you have to be very sharp observer to notice trauma, because everything looks like built over and over. And
we also discussed that.
And it's so this is just like a comment. It's not even a question. But if anyone wants to share anything or wants to challenge both presentations, this is the time to do it. Otherwise, if you don't have any questions, I propose a break. We will have a 15-minute break. Finally, the coffee machine is working. So we can...
But I think it would be interesting if you...
But we can continue if someone wants to talk
explain
after.
A little bit.
They explain our map.
Yeah. If you want to explain the map, please do.
Yeah, it's important.
Because I almost like removed this piece of paper that's standing in the stage.
Maybe explain first the assignment and then we can just briefly.
Okay.
That was what
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, somehow I talk a lot.
No, we asked the students to find a spot in the city which in some way is linked to how they, kind of are thinking about post-traumatic space and whatever. It can be an object, it can be a person, it can be a story, something, because they're in an environment which has gone through a lot, and so our idea was that we shouldn't be simply in an academic institution, but kind of immerse ourselves, and we were so surprised by the amazing work our students have done, a deep research on buildings, on actually stories, on the past, on the present, and so each of the students picked very different parts of the city, and this map kind of presents where they went, and at every place they had to take a photo and sort of share the photo and the story, why they picked a particular place with others.
So, if you want to say your example, for example, is quite interesting.
But when you say deep research, I hope you're saying the beginning of a deep research.
Yeah.
It was a short.
It was not a deep research.
Okay.
It was more of a superficial, but like to get
The beginning of.
But to take out many layers of the...
Yes.
Maybe you can say your example,
Yeah.
Marianne.
Yes. I mean, we all chose like many different sites. So I will just speak for the example that me and Freya chose. And I mean, after this is my second time in Prishtina, and like, of course, like the National Library of Kosovo is such a striking building. Whether it has been selected one of the ugliest buildings or for its, I personally think it's a beautiful architecture. But however, I was intrigued by how and if this building was damaged during the war, and the exterior obviously has not been damaged. So then me and Freya, we kind of went inside to like, I mean, see if there was any trauma like from within the interior, because like as you said as well, this city has been like built over. So we went inside, and then it turned out that the library had quite an interesting history through its use during the 90s as both like the military base for the Yugoslav army, as a refugee camp during the Bosnian war, that it was also used as a school at one time for children to teach them. We're not sure like about like this is the information that we got, and then also for example that when the Serbian army came in they kind of like banned all the Albanian and Kosovo people that worked there. They fired them and replaced them with Serbs, and that they removed all the books and kind of like put them in the Belgrade library and these kind of things. So like the trauma of like the books or like objects within the space. I mean, this is also like quite a superficial research that we did, that what was the information we got at the time, but I mean, it would be interesting to really like go more in depth. But like, yeah, so like this kind of like, yeah, like procedures of like what's actually happening inside. And then we chose a quote that we found like in behind of the reading rooms that was,
this is a thing, not a human. We kind of thought that was interesting in like how like buildings become like targets for like, you know, or like symbols of national identity, you know, people kind of attack then buildings as a way of attacking like a nation, like and it says chocolada underneath. So I mean, it's a sort of a funny piece of graffiti, but you know, the quote sort of just it connects to our ideas like spontaneously.
And then our participant Zula, who was doing her own research there, got locked in the library, and that experienced a personal trauma. Happily, she's with us.
Yes, I was really amazed by the building and was going around and taking photos on the camera. And someone said, "Oh, it's quite empty here. Okay, that's really cool. I can explore." And then I wanted to get out, and there's this big chain, and I'm just locked. And I'm like, okay, this will be a traumatic night. Unfortunately, I get out of the scene. But this was really interesting, as I was considering myself not having a traumatic experience, but in this space, I kind of was on the edge of having it. So I was thinking how this town can, maybe it's inside really deeply, and you can just feel it very deeply.
Can I just add something?
Yeah.
I mean, it was always an iconographic building, you know, somehow it was, but this was not the only one. But I have to say that the most damage done in the architecture, interior, was done after the war. So basically, how they treat the building today, it's like, initially they gave a whole floor, the third floor, to a telephone company or internet-based telephone company established through a USAID project or something, which became then a second telephone company in Kosovo called IPCO. So they basically damaged the interior of the building. Then how they intervene without any care for a building that should be really protected because it has a unique interior as well as the exterior. Or you have this tendency, and you see even these young Kosovo artists or some festivals, everyone wants to be on top of it and take a picture on top of it. and the ceiling, the floor is very sensitive, so it's not made to be on top of it, basically, right? And you will find all over the internet younger artists, some festivals, even 20 people on top of this building, because the selfie is really beautiful. And then immediately after the war, they planted some sort of, if you remember, what was the dinosaur movie, the Jurassic Park, you know, this big pyramid of poo, basically. So they installed a huge fountain, which looked like that, in front of the building, and then they installed this big sign saying National Library. The sign never existed in the architecture before, because before you knew that this is the National Library, it had a small sign. And then we were joking because I mean, I didn't say that, but let's say people were joking how a lot of newcomers in the city needed big signs to know which building is what, because all the villages were burned, let's say, torched, and then a lot of people moved to cities, and you had to put big signs in front of every building so that they know which is the National Library, which is the government building or something like that. But so the Serbian occupation did a lot of damage in other aspects of the building, but the building, besides being cleansed of selected books and whatever, the architecture of the building was not touched during that time. So the architecture of the building was perfectly preserved. Only when we entered after the war, or started with this amateur experimentation and damaging the modernist architecture.
Well, there is a phenomenon of post-war destruction as well.
In other buildings as well. The building of the Parliament of Kosovo, same damage, inside and outside. It's a historical building. So not everything can be attributed to one. But also this story that this was used as a army barrack, or that the refugees were there, or of course during the war itself, during the bombing itself, many buildings were turned into bases, right? So that they hide from their positions. But this was only during those 78 days of bombing, and it was the same with other buildings. But these very easily articulated stories are, and if workers who work in those institutions say these stories, it tells a lot about what kind of an institution it is today. Just to add some.
Yeah, we learned about a couple of other buildings in the very center. You know, Ishbel was researching a Grand Hotel, why it's almost half abandoned, meeting people who work in these two floors that the only one operating, and Chantal was researching the unbuilt Serbian Orthodox Church and the plans that exist in regard to it, and all the legal battles. So, you know, there was a lot of that we learned actually about the very center of the town.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Let's have a short 15-minute break. We continue with the presentation by Jelena Vesić.
Jelena, ćeš ti?
That's program.
Ok, onda nastavljam tu.
We continue with the next lecture presentation. I'm very happy that we have with us Jelena Vesić this year, running a course, a very specific course, I have to say. And I hope you enjoyed your collaboration, all of you that don't need to stand up. Jelena is an independent curator, writer, editor, and lecturer. She's active in the field of publishing, research, and exhibition practice, and intertwines political theory and contemporary art. Her most recent exhibitions are Story and Copy, Academy Schloss Solitude in Stuttgart, and We Are Family with Natasha Ilic, presented in Pavilion in Poznan. Vesić also curated lecture performance, Mocha Belgrade and Kolonische Kunstverein, and Anja Dom and Catherine, together with Anja Dom and Catherine as well as collective exhibition project Political Practices of Post-Yugoslav Art, which critically examines art, historical concepts and narratives of Yugoslav art after the dissolution of Yugoslavia. Her recent book on neutrality, Vladimir Jerić, Vidi and Rachel O'Reilly, is part of the non-aligned modernity edition of the Museum of Contemporary Art in Belgrade. I might add, if I'm allowed, Jelena is also part of Prelom Collective, an important collective which also published a number of editions of an important journal that dealt with similar issues in relation mostly to developments during the 90s in Serbia, but not only.
In Yugoslav space, I would
yes.
say. Yeah.
The floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. I would like to thank first Valja Osmani and Albert Heta for inviting me for keeping inviting me to collaborate with Stacion. So we collaborated actually on many levels several times, and I also would like to thank Neretva and to everyone who helped organization of this school, which is I would say unique and of big importance for this region. And I would also like to thank to the very inspiring group of students who gathered around the course about exhibiting after the end of attention or in the times of post-attention, asking this question, how to exhibit, with whom and why, after the end of attention. And in one of the fields where I'm active is the field of exploration of what is called today exhibition history, which is new field because it tries to approach somehow the practice of history making through analyzing the different art agents and not only placing and centralizing the figure of artists, as was the narration of more traditional art histories. I think maybe this is the biggest contribution that the field somehow makes, but okay, it is an academic discipline, and I made my own also choices within or interventions within this field because I'm mostly also trying to talk about verb exhibiting instead of an exhibition as an enclosed, canonized form, and somehow also enclosed within a system of art. And I wanted rather to open this question of exhibiting, which also includes the process of making, the reason of making, and also includes thinking of how things appear to us and how we appear to things or to each other, or while we observe something, or while we focus, share attention to something. Okay, for today I prepared like one little story from the project which I started 4 or 5 years ago, but I didn't progress much. In the meantime, I took this art historical obligation to work on some, I guess, possibly important art historical books dedicated also to the space of Yugoslav art history and Yugoslav questions. So maybe this next step is also in a way, now when I heard these two very good lectures by dear colleagues Renata and Armina, maybe this topic they're dealing with is also a product of a certain trauma. Maybe not the trauma of division, but the trauma of the emptiness. The project is called, I named it, but as I say, I didn't manage to do much to actually really start this project. Okay, there are some practical reasons, like time is money and money is time, so I'm working as a freelance content provider, as it would be officially named, this kind of function. So like single body in space, but also communicating with many others. The project I named Distant Human Display in Space, which has abbreviation also DHD, to make it like a performatively parascientific. And this is how I named the scattered array of artifacts launched into various directions, creating certain coded environment. I'm analyzing objects which were sent from the Earth from different reasons, but mostly in the name of what is referred to as scientific exploration and communication signaling, some of which concerned with the artistic or other representation of both humanity and its environment, the Earth, to the potential intelligent extraterrestrial other. So basically, this is this immense, vast space where big or little things appear and say, beep, 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 hello, anyone there? Psh, vast space. The human display in space also contains the objects explicitly designated as artworks and events or processes formalized through the term of exhibition. Real exhibition, such as the first art exhibition in Earth orbit, like on Mir Space Station 95, or Moon Museum, which followed Apollo 12 mission in 69, and there are many other exhibitions, traditional exhibitions, quite often really conservative, made in space. However, the primary focus of this research would be around what is called scientific payload to this process, to this actually very masculine processes of launching, I say masculine and phallic, so you send something into space. And the communication messages are usually officially by even space exploration organizations and institutes called scientific payload usually. So like the objects are called scientific payload, and this is the most known projects is the series of researches and exhibitings made by Carl Sagan and his alien communication team between 71 and 77. And I would say that they used artistic means to basically to perform a non-artistic communication of what was understood as scientific facts to the unknown in nature and scale, intelligent species in the universe. Despite their scientific character, one of the goals of this research is to show that such objects could have the status of artworks, being out of human reach now, and thus ideally separated from life. That is, they're reaching the ideal form of artistic autonomy in the modernist sense. In addition, in the same manner as the art is being unavoidably observed within semiotics, a specific message, these works can be understood as a process of constructing and inventing language in a similar, if not the same manner as the art does. The status of scientific payload realizes its ideal autonomy of art until there is the opportunity to realize its primary goal of useful art, of the archaeological material about the earth to be found by the intelligent other, perhaps after our planet had already ceased to exist. And I will talk about one image. I was thinking about title, I didn't find right title. So there are a few. At the outskirts of the Anthropocene, symbolic dust in space, at the limits of exhibiting, or maybe the most remote horizon of exhibiting, around this. So I will speak about one image, but the image which also contains in itself, stores in itself, the history of image making, of imagining by means of visual representation, the scientific imagining characteristic for the epoch of modernity, from Enlightenment onwards, maybe even from Renaissance. Universal representation of joint principle of science and art. One image, which aggregates, contains in itself many other images, imaginations, visual thoughts. It is a visualization of a certain thought. Or maybe we can speak also of the term cognitive mapping. This is the pioneer plaque. Formally and materialistically speaking, it is a rather small object, 23 x 15 centimeters, with a picture engraved into it. Certainly not an artistically elaborate picture, the picture that is meant to show that intelligent life exists in space, and, if I may add that the intellect or intelligence means knowing the secrets of universe, the language of mathematics. It is a gold anodized aluminum plate manufactured by Precision Engraved Shop from San Carlos, California, which was attached to Pioneer 10 and Pioneer 11 spacecrafts from 72 and 73. The plate was designed as a pictogram documenting the existence of intelligent life on Earth, the location of Earth in the universe, and provides generic image of humans to be presented to potential intelligent others. The image was part of NASA experiments and was also in part reproduced on golden record with a lot of media material added, carried by the Voyager spacecraft launched in 1977, the first space mission to leave the solar system and enter interstellar space. Okay, thanks to the banal movie Interstellar, we know now also the scientific term interstellar space. My initial assumption is that Pioneer plaque is the first human-made exhibition artifact, precisely because it depicts and displays the image of human self for the gaze of non-human other, and acts the exhibitionary mode, the mode of showing. The image is displayed in space, it's launched, to use the colonial expression, to terra incognita, that is, to lands unknown, to unknown audience. It shows, demonstrates that intelligent life on Earth is scientifically literate and points to its location in the galaxy, the blue planet. So let's see what's going in reality on Earth at the moment where these pioneers and Voyager are launched. In 1972, there is a fall of Salvador Allende, and the beginning of Pinochet's dictatorship. We see scientists, we see fashion connected to the space exploration. A lot of women. Yoko Ono and John Lennon make this song. Actually, Yoko Ono makes this song, "Woman is the Nigger of the World" performance. Happenings in New York. Sex Pistols produces album and song No Future. Song No Future. There is no future for us while these things are being launched in space to search for some kind of future. So these are the paradoxes. My thesis, which is going to be more palpable as we go deeper into the deeper reading of the image, is that although the image or representation is made for faraway others, it remains chained to the Western humanist pictorial tradition, as well as to what art historian Erwin Panofsky called perspective as symbolic form. And here we see these Alberti's constructions of perspective centralizing human eye. So the perspective, according to Panofsky, has a wider cultural sense. It's a central component of Western will to form, a defining structure of the way we organize the experience, of course contrary to the laws of nature. Perspective is the organizing principle of the form-giving mind. Perspective is an expression of schema linking social, cognitive, psychological and technical practices of modern human culture. Although the far other, the unimaginable other, is an expected receiver of the image, the representation, returns to the gaze of humans, creating another boomerang effect. In the context of the exhibition practices, we can also think of this link between studio and the gallery. So, although, so basically, my thesis would be, and you will see as the story unfolds, how actually this image is returning to the studio, that is to the earth, the space where it's been made. Actually, it addresses, maybe not the other, but to the self of the artist. So the thesis is that it is an artifact that operates in the context or culture of display, but it leaves the orbit of the culture it belongs to and reaches the outside of the space that is controlled, because somehow the exhibition always happens in the space that's controlled and which signification is controlled. And from this distance, paradoxically, now we come to this boomerang effect, people can look onto themselves and appreciate humanity and the great achievements of humanity. I'll show two space landscapes. The relation to the space, understanding of space in philosophical sense, is based on two spatial metaphors. One modern, the perspective as a symbolic form. Another modernist, the horizon, strong symbol. Modernist principle of linear understanding of time, or projective mindset that is socially and culturally oriented towards the horizon of better future, the time that is coming. Franco Berardi Biffo wrote this book, After the Future, where he also explained the idea of future. we see the white cube, the ideal space for exhibiting art, as we are told as art historians, artists, and cultural practitioners. So my question was, why the story starts while this okay, this is something that I should speak about later, so I stick to the order. But the question is why the story about the ideology of white cube starts with the story about spaceship, with the launching spaceship and the gaze that is following this spaceship. But first, here in this context, I should say that the very concept of white cube also operates as a larger metaphor, same as perspective. It is the form that's profoundly linked to modernist conceptualization of the space within the art history and beyond. And as a spatial concept, it symbolizes the epoch of modernity and its promise for better future, because the white cube guarantees the eternal life to the objects placed within it. It celebrates history, it celebrated history, I should say, romantic and idealist tradition, humanism. O'Doherty wrote his text on the white cube in '76 at the moment of the demise of the ideology of white cube, the moment where the historical stage was already ready for hosting the new old paradigm of event culture, when the modernist thought and modernist hope reached one of its ends, of course, prolonged to '77, to '80, or to '89. We can speculate. The pioneer plaque is part of one speculative exhibition scenario, the genre that we can term exhibition in space. But it is also an archival image that, speculatively speaking, may live longer than the Earth itself after the explosion of sun and disappearance of solar system. In a way, the image that may survive its maker, which is often the case with many other images from art history. The object belongs to rather speculative, conceptual and useful art because the probability of its use value, according to the theory of probability, is tiny. The object is small, it's speedy, the space is vast, so the probability that this object is encountered by other intelligent beings is very tiny, but is still some probability. In exhibition theory, we speak of the white cube or black box as symbolic art spaces that are part of display, part of each display piece of art, and there is site-specific as another category. Although with the pioneer plaque, we can introduce the third category of, in example, gray spacecraft. But the exhibition scenario which pioneer plaque is part of fully fits the logic or ideology of white cube, or maybe even the logic that intersects, entwines the ideology of white cube as an absolute place of exposure and Noah's Ark, which is an absolute archive, here zipped into the small image encoded message according to the aesthetics of new technologies. But anyway, representing significant archive on the existence of life on Earth. Speculative exhibition scenario that pioneer plaque is part of is a story on humankind that reenacts the logic of gaze, framed through the concepts of perspective and horizon. And this is how O'Doherty actually starts his story about 20th century politics of art displays, about the white cube and its symbolic form. So, do we have sound? Sagan.
That's here. That's home. That's us. On it, everyone you love, everyone you know, everyone you ever heard of, every human being who ever was, lived out their lives. The aggregate of our joy and suffering. Thousands of confident religions, ideologies, and economic doctrines. Every hunter and forager, every hero and coward, every creator and destroyer of civilization, every king and peasant,
and
every young couple in love,
O'Doherty.
every mother and father, hopeful child, inventor
Both
and
sounds
explorer,
should be.
every teacher of morals, every corrupt politician, every
O'Doherty,
superstar,
the beginning
every
of the text on the white cube, page 13.
and sinner in the history
But the current
of
scene in the sci-fi movies
motive that
shows the Earth withdrawing from the spacecraft until it becomes a horizon, a beach ball, a grapefruit, a golf ball, a star.
arena.
With the changes in scale, responses slide from particular to general. The individual is replaced by the race and we are pushover from the race. A mortal biped or a tumble of them spread out below like a rug. From certain height, people are generally good. Vertical distance encourages this generosity.
On scarcely distinguished
Horizontality doesn't seem to have the same moral virtue.
their misunderstandings.
Parallel figures may be approaching, and we anticipate the insecurities of the encounter.
Our posturing,
Life is horizontal.
our imagined self.
Just one thing after another, a conveyor belt shuffling us towards the horizon. But the history, the view from the departing spacecraft is different. As the scale changes, layers of time are superimposed, and through them we project perspectives with which to recover and correct the past. All of us are now sure that the glut of history, rumor, and evidence we call modernist tradition is being circumscribed by the horizon.
There is nowhere
Looking down, we see more clearly its laws of progress, its armature hammered out of idealist philosophy,
settled.
its military metaphors of advance and conquest.
Where we make our stand.
What a sight it is,
It has been said,
or was,
it is humbling.
almost nostalgic ending. And this is the page. The status of these messages is as follows. Pioneer 10 is heading in the direction of the constellation Taurus, if left undisturbed in a million years or two, or will reach the star Aldebaran, currently located at a distance of about 68 light years. Voyager 1 became, probably sometime in 2012, the first human-made spacecraft to cross heliopause, that is, to leave the solar system. The first human-made object to enter interstellar space. The potential audience of the first exhibition artifact in space is unknown, but this unknown audience is also supposed to be capable to read it, to understand and appreciate its meaning. The language, pictorial representation, is a cross of mathematical and astrophysical formula. The message is communicated in the format of an image, and telling by images is art historically termed biblia pauperum, that is, book in images, or telling to the poor with spirit, illiterate. So the language of pioneer plaque is crossing art and sciences, universal languages of human civilization. The plaque was designed by Carl Sagan and Frank Drake, who provided the concepts, while the artistic direction was headed by Sagan's then wife, Linda Salzman Sagan. Freelance individual initiative of one creative team and a research program made campaigning to make this possible. The idea was to present to whoever finds these images the following: who we honor, we, the universal we. More precisely, how we look, where exactly we could be found, and to show off a bit, to demonstrate that we, humanity, already and on our own merits conquered the secrets of atom and of the universe. And this is science parts. read the image, the way it's constructed, its methodology of telling is similar to another concept by Erwin Panofsky, the concept which he described as realism, which hides certain symbolism, and which he observed in the context of early painting in the Netherlands, and developing actually his iconographic model and using the phrase disguised symbolism existing under the apparent realism. And the image is precisely structured according to iconographic models, that is, reading the surface, that is, floating above the surface and deciphering the code by interconnecting the fragments of composition. Erwin Panofsky also wrote that art historian is like a detective. So, shall we think of that extraterrestrian should be detective as well, and therefore art historian. Universal Man by Leonardo da Vinci. So, the human figures, or self-representation of humans. We see, just to check. Okay. So we see that the humans on this picture are white. Not Asian, not African, but white. Okay, this is how the universality is being made. There are some details. In example, the figure of a woman is a bit colored, potentially, and featured. She stands in a broken, sloppy counterpose, versus the man who is white and schematized, and who is in unnaturally upright position, and he is protagonist of the action. Woman is displaced from the center. We can return. So, woman is displaced from the center of the composition and turned towards the man who stands in the center, while the man, he looks into the eyes of intelligent other. So, like eyes which are in also the tradition of Enlightenment and modernism, somehow understood as the windows of the soul. So, he's looking to the eyes of intelligent other in space, in universe, and transmits the message. The figures are presented as naked. Greatest fuss in regard to human figures at the time was the question of if it is appropriate to show us naked in such a distinguished occasion of encountering another intelligent life form. Of course, the clothing will always add a multitude of cultural elements and will amplify the cultural construction of universal humans and the logic of domination according to which the image is constructed. So the authors decided for a kind of classical sculptural solution. Nakedness is also part of the classicist tradition, sculpture making, and this may be seen as one of the references. So the naked man is a universal man. The same goes for woman, but her nakedness can be discussed in more details. If we apply gender check on the exhibition artifacts, we could see that in the case of female figure, the genitals are not represented, they are absent or erased. Or to put it differently, woman is precisely in this image, literally represented as lacking phallus, according to maybe Freudian theory. And we know from the history that numerous feminist theories, especially in this time, have criticized this very psychoanalytical assumption, a structurally sexist element of science and representation. Controversies about NASA censoring female genitals were ended with the Sagan's admission that he did it himself. That actually he self-censored the image, being worried of reaction. While allegedly NASA was totally fine with having a demarcation line of the pubic area, but left the final decision to the author. So female representation which hides her sex, we can even say her sexuality in the remote sense, and is actually the destiny of women in the Scopic regime dominated by men. And we can think of some examples from the history of art, like an example, L'Origine du Monde by Gustave Courbet, which is made on this double assumption that women genitals were being actually represented despite of morality, but in the room, in the special room where the men were gathering to smoke and talk about politics, and in one moment they could have a look to the Origine du Monde. Or we can also mention a famous example of Valley expert, who measured actually the temperature of the same problem with the representation as a part of contemporary art, that is cinema and correction, genital panic from 69 was made in Munich, where she wear this crotchless trousers and tight leather jacket, with a violet hair, and she roamed through the rows of seated spectators in the cinema, exposing her genitalia on their face level. And it was challenging these double measures of morality and representation of the woman nakedness, sexuality, and body. For the sake of different enjoyments, so she was intervening this logic. Male figure is the holder of communication, the point of contact with XXXI. His gesture is embodied in a sign of right hand lifted up in the air. So woman is just his silent companion. She is subalternized in the eye of extraterrestrials. The sign of right hand lifted up in the air shows the open palm, which is evolutionary sign of intelligent form. Opposite thumb can grab things, do things with hand, but also in the Earth orbit, message of lifting up hand in this way may be read like this man has no weapons, or this man is coming in peace. A body sign of greeting, of the way of saying hi. And certainly this message is so much embedded in anthropocentric logic and culture that it will be hardly readable to any intelligence that in example, has no limbs, or does not make wars, or does not operate within these militaristic dichotomies, war, peace, friendship, enemy. But Sagan and his team had a backup for this one as well, admitting that this hand in the air might not be a universal sign of anything, but at least show that we have limbs that we can move. But if I think the sign, the main figure, he actually does not say hi, he say how or hawk, which is the representation which really stems from also fantasy writing. In example, in Europe it was popular Karl May book about the Indians and the Indian culture, like the Native Americans. It was very popular in Germany and Europe, and also the film is being made The film is being made after book Winnetou, and it's been recorded in Croatia, in Plitvice, to show the environment of Native Americans. So in a way, our white man, the holder of communication, is also cosmopolitan. He speaks different languages, understands different culture, including culture of Native Americans. So he also expresses this cultural hybridity. And now mathematics. These are two hydrogen atoms. The thing is that if we, in example, again return to the whole of image, the text, how we read image, it begins in the upper right corner, which is very Western, very Latin. And this visual representation establishes the language of the plug. The most simple element is in this corner. And this is the element which is hydrogen, and which is the most common in the universe, and which is first in Mendeleev's period table. It shows, this symbol shows that universal language of mathematics is the proof of intelligence and self-consciousness, and also human understanding of atom and particle physics. The two hydrogen elements are in the state of what is known as hyperfine transition, meaning that they produce a wavelength frequency of exactly 21.1 centimeters, and this will be used for measuring of all the fragments of the composition here, on the base of which we know that our female figure is high 168 centimeters. Then there is this graph which represents the location of the Earth in the space, as a measurement unit, actually the measurement unit which can be used that our solar system can be precisely located is here represented through its distance from the 14, the so-called pulsars, which are some kind of weird little stars that beam radiation in regular periods. Actually, and this is a bit of exaggeration in a scientific sense, because of course we know it from sci-fi movies, we need three things, three vectors, the famous triangulation. But here we have 14, which is probably a way to emphasize the welcoming part towards the humans. So the assumption that whoever gets these binary numbers, and some of them of course are matching, can decipher the code and exactly locate the Earth. And under the image there are the planets, the compositional fragment which represents the Sun and 9 planets. Okay, mistake, because Pluto was then considered to be a planet. And so there is a solar system, and there is Earth in the planets from the solar system as a third planet in the row. And next to it, the trajectory of spacecraft is shown. Like, this is the place we came from, so that it is clear in the image. But to return to the image itself, from the pictorial logic of the modern era and from its Eurocentric dimension, this image basically says, this is who we are. This is what we made, the spacecraft. And we rule this place, which is here, which is here. and you can measure it with the help of this. But this is who we are, and this is what we make because this is a schematic representation of the spacecraft. If you pose the question, which image is sent to space, which era is projected through this image, the answer will be that it is definitely the image of the past. In one hand, allegedly, where the image reaches its eventual addressee, it will be already representing, in the way it's made, deep past, because it needs a minimum of 68 light years to travel. But I will locate its meaning and its construction in even more dramatic past tense, and even before it was sent, before it started its long travel. I would say that the image is entirely situated within a Judeo-Christian pictorial logic, within a traditional iconographic pattern that we know as patron's composition. Which is being used since medieval times. So we see here patrons approaching some kind of unknown intelligence, given in some kind of religious being. So they say, this is who we are, this is what we made. It's a spaceship. They're obviously more close, or I don't know, represent for themselves some kind of intelligent other to whom they address. And they obviously rule the place where they're coming from, because otherwise they couldn't be able to make this is what we made. Or something like this. This is who we are, this is what we made, and extraterrestrial intelligence, patron composition. Or maybe, like more future, fantastic painting, Albanian socialist realist painter from 60s. So. Male figure, female figure, male figure, holder of communication, like Rocky Mountains behind, and building something. So this is what are we going to make, and we go into the future. Hi. So, paradoxically, instead of an advent toward the future, the scheme of the image is really the memo of past compositions. And then I connected it. This is another idea of this research, and I should develop it, which is somehow structured around the notion of cognitive estrangement within a sci-fi utopian literature proposed by theorist Croatian, but who also worked in Canada, and who really promoted sci-fi literature as a thinking literature and not as just pulp fiction. And his Darko Sudin. So cognitive estrangement for him is central for the idea of novum in art, society, and politics. But here, in the Pioneer plaque, we operate with the inversion of the cognitive estrangement, and we enter the field of basically its opposite. And I thought of the term cognitive familiarity. So this is this boomerang effect. We are showing it somewhere and we even don't know. So it's the message in a bottle. But in the end, it is only about us and for us. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I open the floor for questions. If anyone wants to comment or add or use the presence of Jelena here. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. Okay. Should I close the lights maybe? I'm not going to make a question.
I'm for drink.
Okay, I'm for drink too. Thank you so much. Let's continue the discussion. Again, yes. And just one reminder about the program tomorrow. So tomorrow we have an opening of the exhibition, the central exhibition of the program this year. And it's our first collaboration with Contemporary. The exhibition focuses on, let's say, a very specific practice. A few years back now, we initiated the so-called Singapore Art Archive project. It archives, it documents artistic practices in a very specific context and location. Just to describe, maybe something that I was also impressed when I found out. And we talk a lot about political change, elections, democracy in Singapore. Since,
now I can.
I mean, this is general knowledge. Since it became an independent country, one political party always wins elections. With the growth of infrastructure, museums, gradually what that context and that the country experiences is the diminishing of the independent sector. So museums not always bring more freedom and more space and more. And this is a very specific context to be analyzed. Prior to the opening of the exhibition, we will have a presentation by Ko about his research. And in this case, he focuses on specific art places, performances that were organized by a generation of artists. That some of them are still active, some of them are not. And it's first attempt to reach out also to that geography. The opening is set for 8 o'clock. The presentation starts at 7. Thank you so much, Jelena, again. Thank you. Project, yeah.